Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 165 of the Liberty Weekly podcast. I am your host, as always, Patrick McFarland, and I am joined today by Keith Knight. How's it going, bud?
Great, Pat. Very excited for the topic today. So many misconceptions around this one that I'm glad we get to quote from some great minds on it.
Yeah, it should be great. And before we dive in, let me remind everyone that both Keith's show and my show can be found at the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org. So today we're going to be talking about individualism. And this is actually kind of a topic that I haven't really covered much on this show. Maybe way back in the first episodes of the podcast, back when Jerry was co-host of the show, for all you longtime listeners out there. But we're going to be talking about Mises and Rothbard's quotes on individualism. So I'll just start us off here as I try and find the share screen function. So we're going to start off with Rothbard's quotes on individualism. He says, "The true science of man bases itself upon the existence of individual human beings, upon individual life and consciousness. The true science of man concentrates on the individual as of central epistemological and ethical importance." So you want to start us off, Keith, with that quote?
Yeah, I really like that one because he focuses on the epistemology. In other words, only individuals can have knowledge. Groups of people can have dispersed knowledge, as Thomas Sowell mentions in his excellent book, Knowledge and Decisions, how knowledge can be dispersed among large groups, which is why you have the division of labor and why it's so important for people to cooperate on a large scale. But still, only the individual can think, only the individual can act ethically or unjustly. So when it comes to, let's say, the police or military or politicians, it's so easy to say, well, society did A, B, and C. And we as a government, the military, it's good that those are shorthand for a certain group of people within the military did thus and so. But it still is important as far as accountability goes, because so often people will say, well, it's not Ted Cruz's fault that he, didn't vote to audit the Fed, even though, he said that it was so vitally important because, it would have just been his vote and that wouldn't have made a big enough change. Well, still, you have to have the principle of accountability with humans because they are the only ones who control their body. So to say that, well, the one person that I can control, myself, I really fall short. But I can talk about billions of strangers and how they should run their lives. I mean, it would be like not being able to have a successful marriage, but telling everyone they have to obey the World Health Organization and billions of people need to take a certain medicine, even though the guy can't even find a wife and make and follow through with the most solid of commitments, the contract to get married. So that's actually my biggest take on individualism altogether. So to see collectivists like Bill Gates getting any attention for any of this trash, well, he generalizes people by country. Everything terrible comes from collectivism and the lack of ability to see the individual as the acting unit.
So I had my buddy over last night for a campfire, and we hadn't seen each other, quite some time. We went to high school together, just reconnected a couple months ago. And he was telling me, I had always kind of thought that he was more of the left side. But it seems like, this whole coronavirus situation has really changed his mind on a few things. And he got his ears perked up and he was like, something's not right here. So we were talking last night, and he was talking about people that he knows in his life who do the NPC thing. And they do the NPC thing to the point where it's actually very eerie, is that all of a sudden they shut off and another person comes out whenever any topic is discussed. And I think that, if we're going at this from an individualist bent, that is part of why it's so eerie, because we know in our hearts and, because of existing in the world and observing people act in the world, we know that every person is an individual. That is what our entire life experience has pointed towards, because it's the truth. It's a fact. And to see someone turn off and all of a sudden connect into the hive mind and be projecting talking points that they've heard on TV is very disturbing. And I guess I didn't really think about it to this point because I don't have people that I intimately know in my real life, that in my personal life, that do this. And to see people that you know intimately all of a sudden vanish and be replaced with a talking head, um, I just thought about how disturbing that was and how it must be, for him. So, yeah, and I think it all really kind of boils down to this truth, is that, the individual is the center of everything, of ethics, of epistemology, and everything. So, it's a great point to start off there that Rothbard makes.
Could you pull up that picture that I sent you? Just because I think that sort of lays out the foundation of what we're getting at here. So when people, especially on the populist right or National Socialists, not to conflate those two, but they will often say that individualism is about doing something by yourself alone. So, like watching TV, playing solitaire, not having friends over, that's individualism. Collectivism is doing things together in a group. So, like football. This is completely missing the point. I think this image does it great. So, for those of you who are listening, it has individualism, two people shaking hands, collectivism, two people with their hands tied together, still resistant on whether or not they should shake. So it's not about cooperation versus not cooperation. It's about voluntary cooperation versus involuntary. So the individual recognizes people's right to opt out and pursue their own happiness according to their own values, since group values cannot exist. Whereas collectivism sees people as though they are cells within a body that could be killed at any moment if the body is determined to have cancerous cells, known as people in this case. So that's why I think this is so vitally important for us to show people that, even let's say you think something like solitaire is done by yourself. Well, because you didn't make the computer, and you didn't make electricity, and you didn't make the mouse you're using, and you didn't invent cards, you are constantly cooperating with people. That's the great insight of economics and Leonard Read's I Pencil essay. So it's all about cooperation. Is it voluntary individualism, or is it coercive collectivism?
So would that kind of be your response then? Because at least in the legal realm, there's that, God, and I can't, Holmes Jr., the justice, who I should know off the top of my head. I think it was him who made that quote that, your freedom ends where something about your fist hitting another person's face. Like your freedom to swing your arm ends, when you almost connect it with someone else's face. But that was always used to justify, like, no man is an island, you know?
No man is an island. Yeah, exactly. No man is an island. We live in a society, and that's why it's important we both have the duty and obligation to not initiate violence or fraud against peaceful people. So, yeah, excellent point, Justice Holmes. Thanks.
Well, see, what I'm getting at though is that he didn't embrace individualism. Is that he tied it into some kind of like, justification as to why we need to restrict, people's freedom to, for some reason, like operate a business in a residential area or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, they have these ridiculous platitudes that make that make no sense. Because if your whole point is your freedom to extend your fist ends where my face begins, well, then your ability to act stops when you start, putting people in jail for victimless crimes and judging them to be bad. So they're saying, well, we can't just let people go unrestricted while they justify an unrestricted government. So it's this very high criteria for all the citizens, but no standards at all for the government. So yeah, you can still embrace that idea, and from that idea extract the self-ownership and non-aggression principle.
Okay, so let's go on to the next quote here. I'm going to circle back to that Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. and unpack that just a little bit more. So don't let me forget that, Keith. But it was just kind of a tangent that I thought of as we were going through this. Okay, so our next quote here. Oops. Individual valuation is the keystone of economic theory. This is from page 289 of Economic Controversies. And this was one of the first things that I learned when I started reading Hazlitt, I believe it was. Oops, sorry about that. Is economics in one lesson. Just the thought that everything really boils down to microeconomics. Like there's no such thing as macroeconomics.
Yeah.
Is one of the first lessons that I learned, because you can't really have one without the other. Macroeconomics it doesn't mean anything if it's not built upon the foundations of microeconomics. So I think this is so funny because I am not a very I have trouble making decisions myself. So it's like, oh, maybe this doesn't apply to Patrick McFarlane, but it does. I joke, but individual valuation. Every day you're making economic choices, and whether you decide to spend your time doing a podcast with your buddy Keith Knight, or whether you decide to spend your time taking a nap upstairs, that's a valuation. That's a valuation that you take. So every choice that you make is an economic calculation. A priori, you can say that because I'm doing this with you, I value the time that I spend doing a podcast with Keith Knight more so than taking a nap, a siesta. So anything to add to that, Keith?
Well, we're going to have to start going through these because this is going to take 5 hours. I mean, subjective value alone, dear God, that can take us in so many different directions. I think Sam Konkin said it best in Agorist Primer. He has a section called Value where he says subjective value leads to individualism. So humans act, and they do so in order to exchange a current state of affairs for a more satisfactory one. That is the nature of action. And anyone who tries to coercively interfere with this is stopping people from increasing their well-being. Now, people will often delegate their options to a financial advisor or a lawyer or a friend or someone who knows more, like a car mechanic, than people work on their own cars. So this is a way you can delegate intellect or responsibility. So what this in effect does is it demolishes any idea of exploitation in the voluntary realm. So it might look exploitative or exploitative rather, for someone to earn a small amount of money while the employer earns a big amount of money. That still doesn't justify forcibly stopping them from achieving their desired ends, especially when you don't have an alternative for them. So it would be the equivalent of saying good-looking people can't date bad-looking people by law because the good-looking people will take advantage of them and exploit them and put them in vulnerable situations. And rich people can't hang out with poor people because then the poor will but just feel pressured to always please the rich one. So you really have to embrace eugenics at the most evil level if if you believe in objective value or the labor theory of value. Well, then you're just immediately a tyrant telling people what things, what people should value in what amount. And it leads to things like, yeah, it's okay if we steal $4 trillion annually because it's better than this. Well, how do you know it's better if people can't opt out? Maybe some people don't want it. Maybe there's negative externalities to this, quote, public good that the state is producing. So, I think subjective value is just so vitally important.
Next quote, the glory of the human race is the uniqueness of each individual, the fact that every person, though similar in many ways to others, possesses a completely individuated personality of his own. It is the fact of each person's uniqueness, the fact that no two people can be wholly interchangeable, that makes each and every man irreplaceable, and that makes us care whether he lives or dies, whether he is happy or oppressed. And finally, it is the fact that these unique personalities need freedom for their full development that constitutes one of the major arguments for a free society. Keith, there is no greater way to demonstrate this to a person than to have children.
Yeah.
Because, and I haven't witnessed this yet, but people tell me when you have kids, people think that they can tell you all about what it is to have kids, which I'm doing right now to everyone. But you see that in you have another kid and they're just completely different than the first one. So there's just no better way. I mean, I guess you see it all through your life is that people are just different. Siblings are different from each other, and so anything to add to that, Keith?
Couldn't have said it better myself.
All right. So the next one, libertarians, if they have any personal philosophy beyond freedom from coercion, are supposed to be at the very least individualists. And if they are individualists, they should be heartily in favor of each individual's advancing of his own ego. What's wrong with ego? Question. So we wanted to define ego. So we grabbed this article right here from Psychology Today. So basically, ego is just the Latin word for I. It was brought up by Sigmund Freud first, but he called it das Ich, which is German for the I, like the self. So he was referring to that conscious decision-making part of you that you regard as I when you say, I dislike my mother, or I decided to change jobs, or I dreamt that my house was on fire last night. That is I, your ego. So it's that part of you that, like, it deals between the id and the superego, the id being your animalistic lizard brain and your superego being the moral and social standards of the society or whatever was imposed upon you or introduced to you by your parents. So anything to add with that?
Nope.
Okay. So the first truth to be discovered about human action is that it can be undertaken only by individual actors. Only individuals have ends and can act to attain them. So this is what Hoppe talked about in the theory of socialism and capitalism, about how even in the Garden of Eden you would have scarcity. I think it kind of ties into scarcity too, because you can only make so many decisions. Like you can't be a drunk and a philosopher at the same time. So
Well, maybe,
you
but
could be,
but at the moment you're drinking, you cannot be distributing philosophy.
or at the, I guess the better one he says is, does he make like the love making thing? Is that,
Yeah, yeah. He says I want to use my body to smoke a cigarette, and you want to use it to have an affair with it. These are a conflict of interests. But I mean that's the whole thing. That even the self ownership principle. I want you to perform labor on my plantation, and you don't want to. There are a number of ways to decide this. We could have the monarch decide. We could democratically decide. We could do 50-50. You get to use your body half the time. I get to use it half the time. We could have councils of the elect, the people with the highest IQ. We could have it determined by races or nation. It could be determined by tradition, or it could be determined by the principle of self-ownership, which is, of course, what we believe in. So it's not a trivial insight to say only human beings act and only human beings have ends, and then we extract that. That literally is the slavery principle that existed for Jesus knows how long, the beginning of human history, up until around the 1900s, where the term, chattel slavery no longer recognized as legitimate. Of course, they just used the draft instead, or call it conscription, some forced labor for the greater good. So still, the principle was embraced on a relative scale, but it has to be taken to its logical conclusion.
next quote. Every individual knows the data of his own inner self best by the very fact that each has a separate mind and ego. So going back to the definition of ego, but also know thyself, that's Shakespeare, I think. So that's from Hamlet. Anyways, Polonius, that's I can use my English major degree there. So yeah, I think that just goes against central planning, is that only you know what's best for yourself. And central planners like to say, well, if given the freedom to choose, people will make the wrong choices. Well, how can you make that value judgment without having the variables yourself? It's true that people make foolish choices, but I think that's a straw man. That was one that my contracts professor said. So,
Yeah, well, people make bad choices, and that's why it's so dangerous to have some people rule over other people and have the right to cage them if they don't obey arbitrary edicts, because people are ignorant and imperfect.
of
So
course.
anything that they say is a shortcoming of freedom not only applies to the state, but it applies to the state tenfold. So, but these are funny. I had used the example earlier of Bill Gates can't run his own marriage, but tells 7 billion people how they should live and all this other stuff. But even if you look at, someone like Joe Biden, who's, knows what's best for 330 million people, said the increasing the minimum wage doesn't cause unemployment. He has said that increasing unemployment benefits does not diminish people's likelihood for getting a job. He spread the drink bleach hoax. He spread the fine people hoax. So we have a total either someone who's so stupid or just a liar. Either way, people still recognize his right to rule. It's like they're not even impressive elites. Like, Putin or Gingrich is certainly an impressive guy, even though, he's terrible on so many things. At least it's impressive. With this, it's like, can't you embrace some sort of your own, even if you're really insecure? Don't you see yourself as better than the dementia patient?
Gingrich, I read a book series by him about an alternative history of the Civil War where the Confederates win at Gettysburg. Really interesting. But that was before I knew who he was. So I enjoyed it. But yeah. So, anyways, the next quote: rugged individualism, also known as social Darwinism, is inhumane and illogical. It is based on a completely false use of analogy and an absurd theory of ethics. I found this one surprising, Keith, because I've always kind of valued rugged individualism. And I go ahead.
I was going to say, do me a favor and pull it up on the screen. I just want to
Yeah.
reread a portion of that. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I forgot to switch the screen over. So I was surprised by this because I didn't know that rugged individualism was the same as social Darwinism. Like this idea that society should be like survival of the fittest in society. I've always thought that rugged individualism was like being a frontier like adventure person, you know?
Yeah, rugged. I think that the idea of rugged individualist or hyper individualist, as often referred to, is someone who like literally is against community or something like that. I mean that's what I've gotten as far as the criticism goes. I don't think I've really met those people, so you're really not giving the ideology its full worth there. A lot of the individualists I know, are very likable, appreciate communities. They like, going to church and, libertarian conventions and having Skype calls and everything. So I'm not sure if those are the same thing. Rugged individualism, I guess that could be one way
Well, maybe
to
what
take
you're
it.
referring to is like why people hate posse comitatus folks. Like if you live in rural areas, have you ever heard of this, Keith? Posse
No.
comitatus. So it's like what most people think of when they hear the word anarchist is there's a group of people who believe that there's an act from the 1800s called posse comitatus that allows them to form their own posse and therefore they don't fall under the jurisdiction of the United States government anymore. So they use an absurd kind of positive law argument to say that they like the law doesn't apply to them. So they can basically do whatever they want and they don't have to like interact with the government, like subpoenas don't work on them, and they'll point to that argument to the posse comitatus act to say that. Well, that's why people hate them. Like they get mixed up with like libertarian anarchists in some ways.
Yeah, and Sam Harris he referred to the oh God, what term did he use? The sovereign citizen cult,
Yeah, it's
of
the same.
course,
Yeah,
of
it's
course.
yeah.
Guy who believes one person called president issues commands that everyone has to blindly obey. That's not a cult, but having standards for the police is a total cult, of course.
Yeah.
So yeah, those people can be annoying and but then again, maybe they're increasing insecurity among police officers and making them at least have more of a justification because, oh God, what if the guy I pull over is a sovereign citizen and he bugs me? I don't want to deal with the hassle. Just putting that small amount of friction will diminish people's likelihood to engage in certain actions. So maybe they're benefiting us. At least they have some standards, but yeah, that they can be a little annoying. I mean, there was a woman in court on court TV who was like, "What's the law, Judge? What's the law?" And every time he started talking, she'd scream, "What's the law? Tell me what it is." So she wouldn't even let him talk, and I don't know if that's a great look. But yeah, some of them I think are really great, and I appreciate their service for fighting for our country and putting their lives on the line.
I would have to talk to them, talk to each individual one to see, what they think about things or what their justification is. So, yeah, I think that's a good point. And so just to end on that note, the rugged individualist glorifies struggle and condemns the easy path. Since the whole process of civilization has been the cumulative attempt to make it easier to satisfy man's desires, the rugged individualist is of necessity opposed to civilization. So, another argument from Rothbard against rugged individualism. Rugged individualism really turns out to be rugged collectivism. Interesting.
I'd like to hear him expand on that. So if we take rugged individualism, no person being able to or desiring to act with others turns out to be undesirable, annoying person, seeing things through a collective sense. I'd have to go to Rothbard versus the philosophers to get the full context of that one.
Yeah, and I think you'll agree that's beyond the scope of what we're here to do today. So, Mises coming up next.
We got enough problems.
Right.
Yeah. Zoom in on it for me. So, here are quotes from regarding individualism from Ludwig von Mises in Austrian Economics and Anthology, page 125. On the market, it is not mankind, the state, or the cooperative unit that acts, but individual men and groups of men, and their valuations and their actions are decisive, not those of abstract collectives. This discovery signaled nothing less than the Copernican revolution in social science. So you hear so many myths that I refer to this as, oh God, I finally came up with a name for it. Now I can't remember. I think I called it unconscious Genesis fabrication. So unconsciously, people will fabricate the origin of something without even realizing it. We have this law because we as a society decided that it was best. When did this happen? You're actually referring to an event. You're saying that people got together and did this thing. Who were these people? When did this happen? And the biggest example is, what we gave, the reason you have to obey the police is we gave them that right. You are saying something occurred. Who was involved? When did this happen? How can this be reversed? What they're unconsciously doing is fabricating something because they don't recognize that or rather they know it, but they haven't processed it, that only individuals act. So you can't say, well, society decided, because that's not a demographic. You can just say the world decided, men decided, or you could use, the Taliban decided to stone women to death. So therefore Afghanistan decided. Well, no, some people engage in actions that are unjustified. So it's really taking these very obvious things, only humans act, and really stretching them to what their logical conclusion is.
All right, the next quote here: in the history of the last 200 years, we can discern the trend towards freedom, the rights of man, and self-determination. This individualism resulted in the fall of the autocratic government, the establishment of democracy, the evolution of capitalism, technical improvements, and an unprecedented rise in standards of living. It substituted enlightenment for old superstitions, scientific methods of research for venerative prejudices. It was an epic of great artistic and literary achievements the age of immortal musicians, painters, writers, and philosophers, and it brushed away slavery, serfdom, torture, inquisition, and other remnants of the Dark Ages. Inveterate prejudices. I had to correct myself.
Yeah, what I get from that is you can certainly see something like, well, in a free market, or actually, again, this is something that also applies to politics, but that you could say, well, if we just have a guy who's selling stuff, what he's doing is he's pursuing his self-interest, selfish, very similar words. So therefore, it's selfish to just own a business and try to make money. Well, then by that logic, it's selfish to be a worker and work for money and be a politician and collect money coercively. But what's amazing is that in a society where there is a free market, you can only make exchanges if other people value what you are providing them at the point which there is a mutually agreed on price by the buyer and seller. So by embracing this idea of individualism and self-interest, you end up creating the public interest, because if the public doesn't like it, they'll disassociate with you, allocate dollars elsewhere, and that's where they want their money to go. So it actually, far from being antagonistic, is actually harmonious when people act in their self-interest. So Leonardo DiCaprio wants to be an actor. Oh, terrible, evil, and selfish. But Quentin Tarantino wants to work with him. And the movie theaters want to buy that movie. And I want to go to the movies and see them. And the cameraman want to film the movie. Everyone acting in their self-interest, far from creating conflict, actually creates harmony. The other thing that he mentioned was scientific revolution and individualism. So as opposed to the Pope said X, therefore X is true, people embraced some sort of individuality and said, well, what reason do I have to believe this authority and not that authority? So it comes from questioning the quote authorities and needing evidence based on the senses to come to a determination. This is the difference between what could be called religious or authoritative thinking versus evidence-based thinking. So if all you say is the doctor said X, therefore X is true. The scientist said X, therefore X is true. The economist says, the history teacher says, the CEO says, the boss says, well, you are engaged in the very same type of primitive religious thinking that you mock because you are referring to an authority. You're not referring to a scientific understanding that involves an observation or hypothesis and experiments and a conclusion. So, understanding the root of that self-interest and authority, I think, is vital.
Yeah, and I was just going to say what you just said, that we've come full circle now, and it's that substituting enlightenment for old superstitions, scientific methods of research for inveterate prejudices. That's full circle. So the next quote here, the philosophy that is the characteristic mark of the West, and whose consistent elaboration has in the last centuries transformed all social institutions, has been called individualism. It maintains that ideas, the good ones as well as the bad, originate in the mind of an individual man. And that's our last quote here, Keith. So I'll let you go off on that.
Well, the ideas originating from men is important because you would want people to be free to engage in such idea or ideological exchanges in order for them to pursue their interests and live in some sort of marketplace of ideas. So if you think Catholicism is correct, well, you might want to make sure there's not a big heavy-handed state that non-Catholics can occupy or can be taken down by one guy making 95 points and just pinning it on the wall. You would want some sort of marketplace of ideas where even if there are a large number of people who don't like Catholicism, well, there's still an incentive and there's still the freedom to distribute Bibles, have churches, make sure there aren't zoning laws stopping people from building beautiful cathedrals that you appreciate. And ideas, of course, are the root of value. So it's like all of the things that go into making this iPad existed, 1,000 years ago. It still was in the earth, but only because of human action and ideas were those resources mixed in such a way to create something that gives me a ton of more value than it would if it was still in the ground or wherever this stuff originates from. Same with cars and steel and everything else. It's ideas where value is found. So to regulate people is to regulate ideas and diminish innovation, and to say, we can't have hierarchies or voluntary agreements because they could be exploitative. Well, you're still stopping people from pursuing ideological ends, which diminishes wealth immediately and in the long run. So that's pretty much all I have on this topic altogether.
Yeah, yeah, and I maybe just to kind of end on this, I recently, I moved to a much smaller town, and I think that moving to a smaller town, you can kind of see these things a little more blatantly. Is that you get to know people so well because there's just not that many of them, so you run into them a lot more often. You're forced to interact with them a lot more often, and I mean, I guess you could pull away, but do you have you lived in a small town? Like I know that you live in a pretty populated area.
The town I live in was so small when I was so younger. I live in the Chandler, Mesa, Gilbert area of Arizona. That's where I've lived and worked. So at the time it was super small, but now all I really know are major town kinds of things. But whenever I see movies of everyone knowing everyone and there being sort of gossip, I think that there could be some benefits to that, or maybe it's just a case of the grass always being greener, and I don't know what I'm talking about.
I think there might be, there's good and bad with everything. It's just different. So it's all about your own preference. Individual valuation choices. We come full circle. So go
And
ahead.
you wanted to say something about Oliver Wendell Holmes again?
Yeah, I did, but I think it's just beyond the scope. I'd have to read because I think he said that in a court decision. So my apologies to the audience about that reference, but I know that he said that, and I've heard a lot of liberals say that. They'll say your freedom to do X Y Z ends here because you might cough and that might infect someone with COVID, and therefore you don't have the freedom not to wear a mask. Is how the logic goes.
Yeah, and your support for government might get people murdered and caged for victimless crimes and destroy trillions in potential wealth with your regulations. I can't. It's amazing that these are people with masters and
Yeah.
doctorates, and they can't even just say, "All right, I'm going to say something. Let me think about this thing I'm about to say, because other people are going to hear it. So let me try and push myself and maybe think of if this applies to me or if there could be alternative examples." They don't put anything. They really are just NPCs.
Yeah. Or have you heard this argument is that I'm not a fan of freedom because what freedom do you have if you don't have wealth? Because you can't do anything unless you have wealth. So we need, a UBI or something, social welfare programs.
Yes. Well, if you want a wealth creating system, free market is, of course, the way to go. And, if I can't be wealthy. I can't be free unless I'm wealthy. Therefore, I'm entitled to wealth. So that entitles people to labor to create wealth, which justifies the ownership of some people over others, which is slavery. Can't be happy unless I have a wife. Therefore, women have the obligation to marry me. It, of course, violates the first rule of your freedom to act stops where other people's lives begin. Yeah. If you want wealth, make sure people are free to create wealth.
Yeah. It just, this whole thing about the fist and the nose, it has the rap or the appearance of being the non-aggression principle, but it's really not.
Yeah,
So,
it again is just one of those things like my body, my choice, or stop the terrorists. So a terrorist is someone who initiates violence against peaceful people for political ends. You know what? Yeah, let's actually take that to its logical conclusion. Any of these things that like make any amount of sense, you can extract the only true principle, uh, which could be applied politically, which is the self-ownership principle. So, yeah, I always try and do that, where instead of saying, here's my idea, let's compare it against your idea. I like taking what they say and extracting the freedom principle out of it.
All right. Well, I'm not going to have a. I usually go in and post and put in a mid roll, but we'll do that now. So, Keith, where can people find your work?
Odyssey.com and Spotify. If you like listening, I am on YouTube if you'd like to be there, but I've had so many strikes that I don't know how much longer I'm going to be there. So please sub to me on Odyssey. This way it'll soften the blow when the inevitable happens.
And how can they support your work?
By checking out the Libertarian Institute or donating to my PayPal or Venmo, which can be found in all my descriptions of videos.
And as for me, you can go to libertyweekly.net/support. You can find Subscribestar, Patreon, and you can go to float.app and support with cryptocurrency. Otherwise, go to odyssey.com, odyssee.com. You can follow me there. I release exclusive content only on Odyssey. You can only find it there. So go sub there, you YouTube folks, and help support the channel with LBC. I really do appreciate that. So those are the places to find our work, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for watching, guys.
Take care.